Woman who spent years shrinking herself just to keep the peace. After 43 years of marriage, Lorraine finally realizes the life she built was slowly destroying her spirit. If you want to know what happened next, keep watching and take a moment to subscribe our channel. The first thing my husband said after he shoved the dining room chair hard enough to crack the plaster behind me was, "Look what you made me do." And the worst part was that I almost apologized. I can still hear the rain against the kitchen windows that night, sharp and hard like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry child. And I remember the smell of burned onions from the soup I had forgotten on the stove because my hands would not stop shaking. My left knee hurt where it had struck the tile floor. The old clock above the refrigerator ticked so loudly it sounded like footsteps coming closer. I was 68 years old. 68, and standing there barefoot in a damp house with peeling yellow wallpaper, realizing I had spent 43 years becoming smaller for a man who still thought my fear belonged to him. What I didn't know yet was that before the next winter arrived, someone would place a stack of letters in my hands that would destroy the story I had built my entire life around. But that night, all I knew was that my granddaughter had heard him yelling through the phone. "Mama," she whispered from 3 counties away, "why are you crying?" I looked at the reflection in the dark kitchen window and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My hair had gone almost entirely silver during the pandemic years. My cheeks had thickened, my shoulders curved inward as though I had spent decades bracing for impact. Maybe I had. "No reason, sweetheart," I told her. And then, after 43 years of marriage, I lied for him one final time. The strange thing about miserable marriages is that they rarely look miserable from the outside. People imagine broken things, announce themselves loudly. They imagine bruises, screaming, police cars. But most unhappy lives are built quietly, one compromise at a time, until the woman inside them can no longer remember when she disappeared. By the time I met Walter Bellamy in 1977, I already knew how to disappear. My father had been a church deacon with polished shoes and a terrifying temper. He believed daughters should be grateful, obedient, and silent. My mother moved through our house like smoke, cleaning things that were already clean, apologizing for rooms being too cold, or too warm, or too loud, or too quiet. I learned very early that love was not something you received naturally. Love was something you earned by causing no trouble. Walter was 31 when I met him. I was barely 20. He had a laugh that filled entire rooms and a way of looking directly into your eyes that made you feel chosen. I worked evenings shelving books at the public library in Cedar Hollow, Ohio, and he used to arrive 15 minutes before closing, pretending he needed history books he never actually read. "You always look lonely in here," he told me once. No one had ever noticed me before. That should have been my first warning. The library smelled like dust and lemon polish and wet wool coats during winter. Walter would lean against the checkout desk, talking about cities he wanted to visit and businesses he wanted to start, and all the ways small-town people settled for ordinary lives. Around him, I felt larger somehow, brighter, important. "You think too much," he used to say, smiling. "You need someone who will take care of the hard parts." At 20 years old, that sounded like safety. You need to understand what this meant. Girls like me were raised to believe endurance was the same thing as virtue. We admired women who tolerated, women who sacrificed, women who carried impossible burdens without complaint. So when Walter convinced me to leave nursing school because his construction business needed support, I believed that was love. When he borrowed money recklessly and I picked up extra shifts at the grocery store to cover bills, I believed that was marriage. When his younger brother moved into our basement for 8 months without contributing $1 while I cooked and cleaned for everyone after working 10-hour days, I believed exhaustion was adulthood. And when Walter began speaking to me with that careful cruelty designed to make a woman doubt her own memory, I believed I was becoming too sensitive. That is how it happens. Not all at once, piece by piece, like wallpaper peeling slowly enough that no one notices the wall beneath it rotting. By 35, I had 2 daughters, chronic migraines, and a habit of apologizing before entering rooms. By 42, I no longer sang while cooking. By 50, I had gained nearly 90 pounds and stopped looking at mirrors directly. Walter always had explanations for everything. That was part of his genius. Nothing was ever truly his fault. The economy failed him. Business partners betrayed him. Customers were dishonest. Banks were unfair. His anger existed because people disappointed him, because pressure followed him, because nobody appreciated how hard he worked. And I believed him because believing him was easier than accepting I had built my entire life beside a man who consumed every ounce of oxygen in the room. There is a sound loneliness makes after decades. Not crying, not silence. It sounds like the refrigerator humming at 2 in the morning while a woman sits alone in the dark wondering if this is all her life will ever be. My younger daughter Elise once asked me why I always flinched whenever her father opened doors too quickly. I laughed. Actually laughed? Oh, honey, I told her, that's ridiculous. But later that night, I stood in the bathroom staring at my own face while Walter snored down the hallway, and I realized my body had been afraid of him long before my mind allowed itself to say the word. Fear. Not terror every day. That would almost be easier. Just constant tension, constant management, monitoring moods, softening truths, anticipating explosions before they happened, like living beside unstable weather. The pandemic changed everything because suddenly there was nowhere to escape. Walter's construction contracts dried up almost overnight, and he spent months stomping around the house furious at the world. The television blared cable news from morning until midnight. Every tiny inconvenience became catastrophe. He criticized the way I folded towels, the way I breathed during arguments, the way I chewed toast. One afternoon in October, I accidentally dropped a ceramic bowl my mother had given me before she died. It shattered across the kitchen floor. Walter looked at the pieces and said quietly, "You ruin everything you touch." And something inside me finally cracked. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a tiny internal sound like ice breaking beneath weight. Because my mother had once dropped that same bowl when I was 12 years old, and my father had said almost those exact words to her. I remember kneeling on the floor, gathering blue ceramic pieces, while the smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen, and realizing I had spent my entire life recreating the only love story I had ever witnessed. I have thought about this moment every single day since. A week later, my granddaughter Avery called asking for help with a history assignment. She was 27 then, living in Chicago, full of sharp opinions and soft eyes. She worked as a social worker helping women in domestic abuse shelters. "Papa sounds angry lately," she said carefully while I searched for old family photographs in the hallway closet. "He's just stressed." "You always say that." There was a pause. Then she asked very softly, "Grandma, are you happy?" No one had ever asked me that before. Not truly. The closet smelled like cedar and old paper and something faintly floral from sachets my mother used to tuck between blankets. My fingers trembled against a cardboard box of photographs. And I realized I did not know the answer. That terrified me more than anything Walter had ever done. Because how do you reach 68 years old without knowing whether your own life has made you happy? The next morning, I drove to the grocery store before sunrise, just to sit alone in the parking lot. Fog clung low across the empty pavement, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee gone cold 20 minutes earlier. And for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to imagine leaving. The thought felt impossible, ridiculous. Like imagining I might suddenly grow wings. I had no degree, very little savings, no close friends left nearby because Walter disliked visitors and slowly isolated us from nearly everyone over the years. My daughters loved me, but they both struggled financially themselves. Besides, leaving a 43-year marriage at my age seemed almost embarrassing, humiliating somehow. Who starts over at 68? What I didn't know yet was that another woman had once asked herself that exact same question, and her answer had been waiting for me inside a sealed wooden box for nearly 30 years. The first person who noticed something changing in me was Nina. Nina Alvarez was 32 years old and managed the pharmacy inside our local grocery store. She wore bright lipstick and running shoes and had a habit of humming under her breath while counting prescriptions. During the pandemic, I started volunteering there part-time, delivering medications to elderly residents because I needed excuses to leave the house. "You apologize too much," she told me one afternoon while we packed insulin deliveries into coolers. I laughed automatically. "Sorry." She looked at me over the rims of her glasses. "See?" The pharmacy smelled like sanitizer and peppermint gum. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the windows. Nina handed me a clipboard. "My grandmother used to do that," she said quietly. She spent 50 years married to a man who made her feel inconvenient. The word hit me harder than crueler ones ever had. Inconvenient. That was exactly how I felt in my own home, like a woman forever apologizing for taking up space. Over the next few months, Nina became something dangerous. A witness. She noticed things other people ignored, the way I checked my phone nervously whenever Walter called, the bruised half-moons on my palm from digging my nails into my skin during stressful conversations, the way relief physically softened my face whenever I arrived at the pharmacy. "You know," she said one snowy evening while locking the front doors, "peace shouldn't feel unfamiliar." I carried those words home like contraband. Walter was sitting in his recliner watching television when I walked through the door. The house smelled stale, sour, like old coffee and resentment. "You're late," he snapped without looking at me. For 43 years, I would have apologized immediately. Instead, I simply hung my coat. Tiny rebellions matter. Sometimes they are the first cracks sunlight enters through. The planning began quietly after that. A separate checking account Walter didn't know existed. Extra grocery cash hidden inside winter boots. A resume typed secretly at the public library because Walter monitored the home computer constantly. I told him the pharmacy volunteer work was expanding into paid administrative hours. He scoffed at the tiny paycheck, which made it easier to hide. Meanwhile, I started therapy through a community counseling program offering virtual sessions for seniors during COVID. The first time Dr. Miriam Feld asked me what I wanted from the rest of my life, I burst into tears so violently I nearly disconnected the video call. The truth was horrifying. I wanted peace more than I wanted love. You need to understand what this meant. Women raised like me often believe survival is the highest possible achievement. We become so accustomed to emotional chaos that calm feels suspicious, unnatural. Dr. Feld once said, "Your nervous system has spent decades preparing for danger that arrives daily. Of course, rest feels frightening." The sentence rearranged something inside me. One night in February, Walter accused me of hiding money because I had purchased a new winter coat without discussing it first. His voice grew louder and louder until spit gathered at the corners of his mouth. "You think you're better than me now?" he shouted. "No." "You think I don't see what you're doing?" I remember the smell of whiskey and chili lingering in the air. I remember my fingertips going numb. I remember realizing he was afraid, not of losing me emotionally, of losing control. And that was when I found out something that changed everything. Walter had quietly taken out a second mortgage on the house 6 months earlier without telling me. I discovered it accidentally while sorting mail after he fell asleep in front of the television. The envelope came from a bank 40 miles away. At first, I thought it was junk mail. Then I saw the balance. My vision blurred so badly I had to sit down. He had borrowed nearly $80,000 at 69 years old against the only real asset we had left. When I confronted him the next morning, he blamed me. Of course he did. If you'd supported me properly during the pandemic, I wouldn't have needed help, he said. I stared at him across the kitchen table while the cough maker hissed between us. And suddenly I saw our entire marriage clearly. Not as a tragedy, as a pattern. Walter destroyed. I repaired, Walter risked. I rescued, Walter demanded. I disappeared, and I finally understood that if I stayed, I would spend the last years of my life drowning beside a man who mistook dependence for devotion. So I began preparing to leave him, not emotionally, strategically. Women my age know things younger women do not. We understand survival often requires patience instead of drama, quiet instead of confrontation. I consulted a legal aid attorney 2 towns over and told Walter I had started volunteering additional hours at the pharmacy. I copied financial documents while he showered. I hid important papers inside old quilting boxes in the attic because Walter never touched anything domestic. I learned which neighbors would answer the phone if I needed help quickly, and every single day I acted normal. That was the hardest part. Pretending. Smiling during dinner while secretly planning escape routes. Listening to his stories while mentally calculating bank balances. Lying beside him in bed, knowing I was slowly dismantling the life we had built. Sometimes guilt hit me unexpectedly. Walter could still be charming, funny even. He brought me tulips once after an argument and kissed my forehead while I cooked spaghetti. You know I love you, he murmured. And there it was. The confusion. Because cruel people are rarely cruel every minute. If they were, no one would stay. The tulips smelled sweet and earthy on the kitchen counter. 3 days later, he called me useless because I forgot to buy mustard. That is how women lose themselves. Not from constant hatred, from intermittent tenderness that keeps hope barely alive. Spring arrived slowly that year. Muddy roads, damp wind, robins returning to telephone wires. One afternoon, Nina helped me load pharmacy boxes into my trunk and suddenly asked, "Do you have somewhere safe to go if you ever need to leave quickly?" The question froze me. She must have seen something on my face because she immediately looked regretful. "You don't have to answer." But I did answer. "No," I whispered. Nina nodded once. Then she handed me a folded piece of paper. "My aunt runs a transitional housing program in Columbus," she said, "just in case." The paper trembled in my hand all the way home, not because I planned to use it, because someone finally believed I might need it. That night, Walter screamed at me for overcooking pork chops. Halfway through his rant, I found myself studying the deep lines around his eyes, the thinning gray hair above his ears, the exhaustion hidden beneath anger. For the first time, I felt something unexpected. Pity. Not love. Not fear. Pity. Because he had spent his entire life believing power and intimidation were the same thing as strength. And underneath all his rage was a terrified aging man watching the world move forward without him. The realization did not excuse anything, but it explained more than I wanted it to. A month later, my older daughter Caroline called, saying she found old boxes belonging to my mother while cleaning her basement. "You left them here years ago after Grandma died," she said. "Do you want them back?" I almost said no. Then something made me pause. "Yes," I told her. "Bring them." The boxes arrived on a humid Sunday afternoon, smelling faintly of mildew and lavender. Walter barely glanced at them. More junk, he muttered. Inside were recipe cards, faded photographs, costume jewelry, and stacks of old letters tied carefully with pale blue ribbon. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately, but the letters were not addressed to my father. They were addressed to a woman named Eleanor. What she told me next changed everything I thought I knew. And I need you to understand what that meant before I tell you what it was. My mother had died believing silence protected people. She rarely discussed her feelings, rarely discussed the past at all. I knew almost nothing about her life before marriage. So sitting there on the living room floor, reading intimate letters written in her careful, slanted handwriting, felt almost like hearing a ghost speak aloud. The letters revealed that when my mother was 48 years old, she had secretly planned to leave my father. If you like this story, hit like button. It will help the channel to grow and to reach more audience like you. For nearly a year, she had saved money, contacted an apartment complex, spoken with attorneys. She even wrote about fearing his temper. But then my younger brother became ill. Medical bills mounted, and she abandoned the plan entirely. One sentence shattered me completely. I do not know whether staying makes me loyal or simply afraid. I read that line over and over while evening sunlight moved slowly across the carpet. My mother had known. All those years she had known. And suddenly I understood something unbearable. She had not been weak. She had been trapped. Just like me. The smell of Walter's cigarette drifted through the screen door from the porch outside while I sat holding those letters, with tears running silently down my face. 40 years? 2 generations of women sacrificing themselves to keep unstable men comfortable. The pattern stopped with me. It had to. That night I copied every letter and stored the originals inside my safety deposit box at the bank. I did not fully understand why yet, only that they mattered. A week later, Walter found legal paperwork in my purse. Not divorce papers, just financial copies. But suspicion exploded instantly. "You planning something?" he demanded. The house felt unbearably hot despite the rain outside. Sweat gathered beneath my collar. "No, don't lie to me." His voice had lowered dangerously. That always frightened me more than shouting. Then he grabbed my wrist. Hard, not enough to bruise dramatically, just enough to remind me he could. And in that moment, something inside me went cold instead of scared. I looked directly into his eyes and thought, I cannot die here. The clarity of that thought stunned me, because for years I had framed leaving as selfishness, disruption, failure. But suddenly staying felt dangerous in a deeper way. Not physically alone, spiritually. Like remaining would erase whatever small part of me still existed. 3 days later, I signed a lease on a tiny 1-bedroom apartment above a florist shop in Columbus. The apartment smelled like paint and roses. I cried the entire drive home afterward, not because I regretted it, because I realized I had just made a decision my mother never got the chance to make. The move itself happened slowly, carefully. I told Walter I needed temporary space because our arguments were damaging my mental health. He raged, manipulated, sobbed once unexpectedly. "You're abandoning me," he said, and there it was again. The strange thing about people who drain you for decades, they often experience your boundaries as cruelty. I reassured him constantly at first. Told him maybe separation would help us heal, help us breathe. I hated myself for lying, but truth would have escalated things dangerously. "You'll come back," he kept insisting. I never answered directly. The morning I left, the air smelled like cut grass and gasoline from a lawnmower somewhere down the street. My suitcase wheels rattled against cracked pavement. Walter stood on the porch, watching silently. "You think somebody else will want you at your age?" he asked finally. I stopped loading boxes, and something remarkable happened. For the first time in 43 years, his words did not enter me. They hovered in the air between us and died there. I think, I said quietly, I would rather be alone than afraid. Then I drove away. My apartment overlooked an alley behind the florist shop where delivery trucks arrived every morning before sunrise. The first week there, I barely slept. My body kept waiting for criticism that never came. Trauma leaves echoes. I would accidentally spill coffee and immediately panic, burn toast and brace for shouting. Take too long folding laundry and feel guilt rise automatically inside my chest. Dr. Feld called it nervous system memory. You survived by anticipating emotional danger, she explained during therapy. Your body doesn't know you're safe yet. Safe. The word felt almost luxurious. Walter called constantly at first, sometimes crying, sometimes furious, sometimes charming enough to make me question everything. I miss you, he whispered one night. And part of me missed him too. Not the reality, the hope, the version of us I had spent decades trying to create. Loneliness after long marriages is complicated. Even unhappy routines become familiar companions. The florist downstairs played jazz music every morning while arranging bouquets. I started buying fresh flowers simply because no one could complain about the expense anymore. One evening, Nina visited my apartment carrying soup containers and cheap wine. You look different, she said immediately. How? Like you can hear yourself think? We ate tomato soup beside the open windows while summer rain cooled the city streets below. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed loudly. Music drifted from a passing car. And for the first time in years, I felt present inside my own life. Then Walter discovered the separation was permanent. Everything changed after that. The harassment intensified immediately. Angry voicemails, financial threats, accusations to family members that I was mentally unstable. He contacted my daughters, constantly trying to manipulate them into pressuring me home. One night he appeared outside my apartment building unexpectedly. The terror I felt seeing him beside my car nearly buckled my knees. You owe me a conversation, he snapped. No! After everything I gave you, rain soaked through my sweater instantly. I could smell cigarettes and wet concrete and Walter's familiar aftershave all at once. Then he said quietly, You think you can rewrite history now? And this is where everything changes. Because suddenly I understood something enormous. Walter truly believed himself betrayed. In his mind, he had worked hard, provided, sacrificed, loved me imperfectly perhaps, but genuinely according to the only model he understood. That realization complicated my anger in ways I still struggle to explain. He was not a monster in his own story. He was a man terrified of abandonment, repeating generations of emotional damage he never examined. But understanding someone's wounds does not require surrendering your life to them. You should go home, I told him. You are my home. No, I said softly. I was your shelter. The difference mattered. His face changed then. Not rage exactly, recognition, as though somewhere deep down he finally understood I was truly gone. The divorce process lasted nearly 2 years because Walter fought everything. Money, property, pension distributions. He dragged negotiations endlessly, hoping exhaustion would force me back into compliance. But something fundamental had changed inside me. I no longer feared disappointing him. Therapy helped, so did distance, so did small, ordinary freedoms most people never think about. Eating cereal for dinner without criticism. Opening windows whenever I wanted. Watching movies he used to mock. Sleeping diagonally across the bed. Healing rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Often it resembles tiny daily acts of permission. During this time, Avery visited often from Chicago. One afternoon, we walked through a farmer's market downtown while violin music floated between crowded stalls. "You seem lighter," she said. I smiled. "I feel older, actually." "That's not the same thing." No, it wasn't. Because for the first time, my age belonged to me instead of to sacrifice. Several months later, Caroline admitted something through tears while helping me unpack boxes. "I used to pray you'd leave him," she whispered. The confession stunned me. "You knew?" "We all knew, Mom." The apartment smelled like dust and cinnamon candles. Outside, snow drifted quietly past the windows. "I thought staying protected you girls." Caroline shook her head slowly. "It taught us what love looked like." I sat down hard on the couch because suddenly the weight of generational inheritance became painfully clear. Children absorb relationships like weather, not through lectures, through atmosphere, through watching women shrink themselves daily and calling it devotion. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Caroline knelt beside me and took my hand. "No," she said gently, "you finally showed us something different." That night, I reread my mother's letters again, especially the final one. I sometimes wonder whether women like us disappear so slowly we do not notice until decades have passed and there is almost nothing left except responsibility wearing our face. I carried that sentence for months afterward. Then unexpectedly came Thomas. Not salvation, not rescue, just Thomas. We met at a community gardening program run through the senior center. He was 71, widowed, soft-spoken, with rough carpenter hands, and a habit of listening fully before responding. The first thing I noticed was how calm I felt around him. No performance required, no monitoring, no emotional weather systems to navigate. Just ease? That frightened me initially more than conflict ever had. Trauma confuses peace for emptiness sometimes. One afternoon, while planting tomatoes, Thomas handed me gardening gloves and said, "You always brace before people touch you." I froze. The garden smelled like wet soil and basil under the summer sun. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "No," I whispered, "you're observant." He nodded once. Then, very quietly, "So are you." There was no dramatic romance, no cinematic declarations. Just consistency. He called when he said he would, asked questions and listened to answers, disagreed without cruelty, apologized easily. The first time he reached for my hand across a diner table, I nearly cried from the gentleness of it. You need to understand what this meant. I had spent decades believing relationships required endurance, management, emotional labor so constant it became invisible. Thomas made me realize love could also feel restful. Not boring. Safe. There is a difference. Walter remarried briefly 3 years after our divorce to a woman named Denise from Toledo. The marriage lasted 8 months. When I heard the news, I sat quietly for a long time beside my apartment window, watching buses move through evening traffic. I did not feel victorious, only sad, because some people spend entire lives searching for new scenery instead of new understanding. A year later, Nina invited me to speak at a support group for older women leaving emotionally abusive relationships. I resisted initially. "I'm not brave," I told her. She laughed softly. "Bravery isn't loud, Lorraine." That was the first time I realized I had not told you my name. Lorraine Whitaker, 72 years old by then. Divorced after 43 years. Alive. The support group met inside a church basement, smelling faintly of coffee and old hymn books. Folding chairs scraped across linoleum floors, while women introduced themselves nervously. Some were 60, some 80. One woman still hid grocery money from her husband after 50 years because he monitored every purchase. Another confessed she had not chosen her own haircut in decades. Tiny imprisonments, massive consequences. When my turn came, I looked around the room at faces lined by survival and said the truest thing I knew. You do not have to hate someone to leave them. Silence filled the room. Then several women started crying, because that is the part nobody explains. Sometimes love exists beside damage. Sometimes compassion survives alongside fear. Sometimes the person hurting you is also wounded deeply themselves. And still, you are allowed to save your own life. What I didn't know yet was that one final conversation with Walter would give me something I had not realized I needed. Not closure, something stranger. Freedom from carrying his humanity for him. He called unexpectedly last autumn after nearly a year without contact. I'm sick, he said simply. Lung disease. Years of smoking finally catching him. I drove to see him 2 weeks later because despite everything, 43 years leaves roots inside a person. His house smelled medicinal now, sterile, smaller somehow. He looked older than I remembered, frailer. You look happy, he said quietly. I did not know how to answer that. We sat in silence a while, listening to wind rattle dead leaves across the porch outside. Then he surprised me completely. My father used to lock my mother outside during winter arguments, he said suddenly. I stared at him. He said fear kept women loyal. Walter coughed hard into a handkerchief. I swore I'd never become him. There it was, the ghost beneath the ghost. Generations of damaged men teaching sons domination before tenderness. I did love you, he whispered finally. And for the first time in my life, I believed him completely. Not because his love had been healthy, but because broken people often love with the only tools they possess. The realization did not erase anything, but it loosened something heavy I had carried for years. I know, I told him. And I did know. That was the tragedy. Love alone is never enough where safety does not exist. When I left his house that evening, cold air burned my lungs sharply. Somewhere nearby, someone was burning firewood. The scent drifted across the darkening street. I sat inside my car, gripping the steering wheel, and cried for the young woman I used to be. The girl in the library who thought being chosen meant being cherished. The wife who mistook endurance for goodness. The mother who believed disappearing kept peace alive. I cried for my mother too. For all the women who stayed because leaving required resources or courage or timing they never possessed. And then I drove home. Home. Even now, the word feels miraculous. Thomas and I moved into a small house near Columbus last spring. Nothing extravagant. White shutters, tiny garden, wind chimes on the back porch. Sometimes I still wake suddenly expecting criticism waiting somewhere nearby. Healing is not linear at 73 any more than it is at 30. But now when fear rises, there is space around it. One evening recently, Avery visited while I cooked soup. She stood watching me chop carrots beside the kitchen window while autumn rain tapped softly against the glass. You hum now, she said. What? What? You hum while cooking. Grandma Evelyn used to also. The knife stopped in my hand, because she was right. Without realizing it, I had begun singing quietly to myself again. The soup smelled like rosemary and garlic and fresh thyme from the garden Thomas planted outside. Warm light filled the kitchen. Somewhere in the living room, jazz music drifted softly from the radio. Ordinary things. That is the point. Not dramatic happiness. Not perfect endings. Just ordinary peace after extraordinary endurance. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone washing dishes while rainwater slid down the dark windows. And I thought about my mother's letters. About Nina noticing my apologies, about Caroline praying I would leave, about Walter becoming the thing he once feared, about the terrible inheritance silence creates inside families, Then I dried my hands slowly and opened the back door. Cold air rushed into the kitchen, carrying the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. The wind chimes stirred softly above the porch. Thomas looked up from his chair near the garden. "You coming out here?" he asked. "In a minute," I answered, and suddenly I understood something I wish someone had told me 50 years earlier. A life does not have to become spectacular to become yours again. Sometimes freedom sounds like nobody yelling when a bowl breaks. Sometimes it looks like choosing your own curtains. Sometimes it is simply the absence of fear in your own kitchen. I spent decades believing survival was the same thing as living. It isn't. Living begins the moment you stop organizing your entire existence around someone else's storms. If this story found you today, and some part of you has been quietly disappearing inside a life that no longer feels like your own, I hope you remember that even after decades, even after fear becomes routine, even after you forget the sound of your own voice, there are still futures waiting patiently for you to arrive inside them. We will be here next week. Another story, another woman, another life quietly unbroken.